There's a truth about silver that almost no one talks about. Not the traders, not the TV analysts, not even most of the so-called precious metals experts. It's the kind of truth that doesn't come up in casual conversation because it's buried in fine print. And yet it's a truth that in a single day could make 90% of your silver holdings disappear from your control while leaving just one single coin untouched. Why does this matter? Because history has already shown us what happens when governments run out of options. And when that moment comes again, and it will, this secret clause will not care about your hopes, your plans, or the amount of silver you thought you owned. The thing most people overlook is that in every financial system, there are layers of rules. There are the rules you see, the ones printed on your bullion certificate, your brokerage agreement, or your government's official mint website. And then there are the rules beneath those rules, the ones buried in legal code, regulatory definitions, and international agreements. The ones so few people read that for most they might as well not exist. But those hidden rules are where the real game is played. When governments face a crisis, and I don't mean a temporary slowdown, but the kind of structural crisis where debts are unpayable and the monetary framework itself is in question. They don't improvise policy from scratch. They go into the toolkit that's been built over decades and they pull out measures that have already been legalized, authorized, and tested. That's where the hidden legal triggers come into play. They're not conspiracy theories. They're not whispers in the dark. They are written in plain legal language that no one bothers to read until it's too late. One of those triggers is the power to redefine the monetary status of assets. In the case of silver, most people assume it's outside the reach of confiscation or forced redemption because it's not part of the formal monetary system in the way gold was in the early 20th century. But this assumption is fragile. All it takes is a change in legal definition, a shift in the categorization of what counts as monetary silver, and suddenly the coins and bars you've been stacking for years move from being a private store of value to a regulated, reportable, in extreme cases, reclaimable form of property. The precedent is already there. In 1933, gold was subject to Executive Order 6N2, which compelled holders to turn in most of their gold to the Federal Reserve in exchange for paper currency. There was nothing mystical about how it happened. The government simply invoked the authority it had already granted itself. And while gold and silver are different in today's legal framework, the principle is the same. If the financial stress is great enough, and if those holding the metals are seen as standing outside the needs of the system, the definitions will be rewritten overnight. This is why the hidden legal trigger matters so much. You don't have to see it activated to know it exists. The legal language is there in commodity regulations, customs classifications, and the tax code. It's in the fine print of international trade agreements that define certain metals as strategic materials in emergencies. It's in the clauses that allow governments to restrict the movement of these materials across borders under national security provisions. You can see it in how bullion is treated differently from collectible coins in both tax law and import-export regulations. The distinction is subtle in normal times, but in a crisis, it's the difference between keeping your metal and losing it. And here's where psychology works against most people. We think of silver in terms of ounces and price per ounce. We think about premiums, mint mark's purity. But we rarely think about its legal identity. Is it classified as legal tender, as bullion, as scrap, as a collectible? Each classification comes with a different set of rights and restrictions. And the ability to flip that classification is exactly what gives the hidden legal trigger its power. When you look at the macro environment today, the debt levels, the deficits, the quiet accumulation of metals by central banks, the growing instability in currencies, it doesn't take a leap of imagination to see how such a trigger might be used. Imagine a scenario where the monetary authorities announce that to stabilize the currency, all monetary silver must be reported and, if necessary, contributed at a fixed price. They redefine monetary silver to include merely every form of bullion bar and standard coin. The only exemptions are specific, narrowly defined categories, perhaps certain historical coins or collectibles that don't meet the definition of current monetary silver. Overnight, everything else you own in metal form becomes subject to control. That's how the game is played. It's not about dramatic scenes of agents knocking on doors. It's about paperwork. It's about legal status. It's about the silent shift in definitions that changes ownership from a private right to a regulated privilege. And because the rules are already written, there will be no need for debate, no act of parliament, no voter approval. The authority is already there waiting for the moment when it can be used. This is why understanding the hidden legal trigger isn't paranoia, prudence. The most dangerous threats to your wealth are the ones that don't announce themselves with flashing lights. They're the quiet clauses, the buried definition, the lines of legal text that everyone ignores until they've already taken effect. You can't control when the trigger will be pulled, but you can decide whether you'll be standing in its path when it is history as a way of looking inevitable. In hindsight, we look back at the major economic shifts of the past and tell ourselves that the signs were obvious, that people should have known what was coming. But the truth is, most people living through those moments didn't see them for what they were. They thought the rules were fixed, that the promises made to them would hold, and that their assets were secure. And then almost overnight, the rules changed. One of the clearest examples of this happened in 1933. At the time, the United States was in the depths of the Great Depression. Banks were failing, unemployment was soaring, and public trust in the financial system had all but collapsed. Gold was still part of the formal monetary system. Then the dollar was tied to it, and it was the anchor of confidence for both domestic and international trade. Ordinary citizens owned gold coins, certificates, and bullion as a way to store value because it had always been legal and accepted to do so. Then in came Executive Order 6202. On the surface, it looked like a patriotic measure. The government was asking citizens to contribute their gold to help the country recover, but it wasn't optional. Holders of most forms of gold were legally compelled to turn them in to the Federal Reserve in exchange for paper currency at a fixed price of 20 total 67s per ounce. And once that gold was in government hands, the price was raised to 35 per ounce, instantly devaluing the dollars people had just been paid. Wealth was transferred from private citizens to the state in a single move, without violence, without protests, simply by rewriting the rules. The part that most people miss and still miss when they tell this story is that not all gold was treated equally. Certain coins defined as rare or collectible under numismatic classifications were exempt from the order. If you happened to own those coins, you were allowed to keep them. Their value didn't just survive the confiscation. It often increased because the supply of privately held gold had been reduced. Those who had them came out ahead. Those who didn't lost their most reliable store of value in a single stroke. That's the power of precedent. Once a mechanism has been used, it becomes easier to use it again. It sets a template both legally and psychologically. Legally, because the framework remains in the system, often in modified form long after the immediate crisis has passed. Psychologically, because people begin to accept that extraordinary measures are possible when circumstances require them. Worth noting that the gold confiscation of 1933 wasn't unique to the United States. Other countries have taken similar actions in times of stress. In Australia, 1959, laws gave the government the authority to compel gold sales to the Reserve Bank. In the United Kingdom, gold ownership by citizens was severely restricted for decades. These were not acts of random aggression. They were presented as rational, necessary steps to protect the stability of the national economy. And in every case, there were categories of assets treated differently under the law, some spared, some not. People often comfort themselves by saying that was then, this is now. But that's exactly the kind of thinking that blinds people to risk. The tools used in the past didn't vanish. When the crisis ended, they were written into the legal and regulatory code, sometimes in ways that make them easier to use in the future. All it takes is a shift in definitions, change in the declared priorities of the state, and the same kind of measure can be applied again, this time to whatever asset is deemed strategic or essential. If you hold silver today, easy to believe it's safe because it's not currently part of the formal monetary system. But the gold holders of 1933 probably thought the same thing. They believed that what they own was theirs by right, that the government couldn't or wouldn't take it. They underestimated both the willingness and the ability of the state to act when under extreme financial pressure. And they overlooked the fine print that allowed for exceptions, exemptions, and reclassifications. The lesson from history isn't just that governments can change the rules. It's that they often do it in a way that catches the majority off guard while leaving a small minority untouched. The difference between those two groups is almost never luck. It comes down to preparation, to understanding the legal landscape, and to holding assets in forms that occupy the safest possible category under the law. When you study these historical precedents carefully, start to see the patterns. You see how the moments that felt stable were already laying the groundwork for the shift. You see how compliance was framed as a civic duty. You see how the winners were those who positioned themselves in advance, often without broadcasting what they were doing. And perhaps the most sobering thing you see is this. Once the precedent exists, it never truly goes away. It waits in the background, ready to be used again. The faces in government change. Crises take different forms, but the underlying logic remains the same. When the system is under enough stress, the rules will bend. And when they bend, they rarely bend in your favor, unless you've already learned the lesson that history has been trying to teach all along. We're living in a time when the underlying pressures on the financial system are far greater than most people realize. On the surface, the economy still functions. Money moves through the system. Markets trade every day. Goods are on store shelves. But beneath that surface is a set of structural imbalances that can't simply be wished away. The numbers don't add up. And when the numbers don't add up, the rules eventually have to change to make them add up. That's the environment in which the kinds of measures we've seen in the past, the legal triggers, the redefinitions, the sudden changes in ownership rights become not just possible, but probable. The first and most obvious pressure is debt. Global debt, public, private, and corporate, has reached levels that dwarf anything in recorded history. This isn't just about a single country or a single currency. It's a global phenomenon, and it's systemic. Debts are growing faster than economies can pay them back, and the cost of servicing that debt is rising as interest rates move higher. There are only a few ways out of a debt trap: this deep default, restructuring, or inflation. All three involve some kind of wealth transfer, and none of them leave asset holders untouched. Second, trust in paper money and fiat currency is being quietly eroded. You can see it in the slow but steady accumulation of gold by central banks. You can see it in the way more investors are diversifying into tangible assets, whether it's real estate, commodities, or precious metals. You can see it in the way countries are exploring alternatives to dollar-based trade. Is the foundation of any monetary system, and once it starts to crack, governments are forced to act in ways that protect their own stability, even at the expense of individuals. Third, geopolitical tensions arising. Trade conflicts, sanctions, and resource competition are all becoming more pronounced when nations start thinking in terms of economic survival rather than cooperation. The idea of controlling key resources, including monetary metals, becomes much more acceptable. History shows that in such moments, governments reclassify, seize, or restrict strategic materials that include silver, especially if it's deemed essential for industry, technology, or currency stability. Silver today occupies a strange position in the monetary ecosystem. It's not an official reserve asset like gold, but it's deeply embedded in industry and investment markets. It's used in everything from electronics to solar panels to medical applications that makes it both a commodity and a store of value. And because it has this dual identity, it's far easier for a government to justify bringing it under tighter control in a crisis. They don't have to call it confiscation. They can call it a measure to protect industry, to secure supply chains, to prevent hoarding, or to stabilize the economy. The legal frameworks for doing this already exist. Commodity laws, trade restrictions, emergency powers, and customs classifications all provide the means to change the status of silver overnight. And just like in 1933, it wouldn't affect every form equally. Certain legally defined categories could be spared, but standard bullion, the kind most people own, could be swept up in a reclassification. That's why the conversation about what form of silver you hold isn't a niche concern, central to whether your wealth survives intact. This is relevant now because the pressures are converging. Economic instability, political division, global realignment, and technological change are all happening at the same time. The last time we saw conditions like this in the 1930s and again in the 1970s, the monetary rules shifted in ways that fundamentally altered what it meant to own wealth. People who thought they were safe found out otherwise. People who anticipated the shift preserved what they had, and in some cases came out ahead, tempting to believe that the system we have today is too advanced, too modern, too interconnected for such measures to be taken again. But the truth is the complexity of the system doesn't make it more stable. It makes it more fragile. When a complex system fails, it fails fast. And when it fails, those in charge don't have the luxury of long debates. They use the tools available to them, the ones already written into law, to restore stability as they define it. That's the world we're living in now. It's a world where the possibility of a sudden redefinition of asset ownership isn't an abstract risk. It's a rational expectation. If you understand the incentives of those managing the system, you don't need to predict the exact date or the exact form it will take. And you just need to understand that when the next crisis hits, the same playbook that's been used before will be used again, adapted to modern conditions, but with the same core principle. The needs of the system will outweigh the rights of the individual. It isn't about fear. It's about realism. It's about understanding that the history we read in books isn't behind us. It's the guide to what comes next. And right now, all the conditions that made those historical measures possible are not only present, intensifying. That's why this matters today, not someday in the distant future. The window to prepare is always open until it's not. In every period of economic stress, there are patterns, not just in how markets behave, but in how the rules are applied. The majority always gets caught in the net, and a small minority always slips through. That minority isn't usually lucky. They're deliberate. They understand that the legal structure of an asset is just as important as the asset itself. They choose to hold it in a form that is treated differently under the law. And when the inevitable moment comes when the state redefines, restricts, or reclaims, they are left standing with their wealth intact while others watch theirs vanish. With silver, same dynamic exists. If a government decided tomorrow to reclassify monetary silver and bring it under control, most standard bullion bars, rounds, widely circulated investment coins would be swept into that definition. But not all silver is created equal in the eyes of the law. There is a narrow category of coins that sit outside the standard definition of bullion. And it's that distinction that can make all the difference. These coins are often described as collectible or numismatic, but the name isn't the important part. What matters is their classification. They're defined not as modern bullion, but as historical or rare coins, often with a face value that no longer corresponds to their market value. They might have been minted before a certain date, made in limited quantities, or produced with designs that place them firmly in a collectible category. Because of these distinctions, they fall under different rules and tax codes, trade regulations, and in some cases, emergency powers. This isn't about hiding from the system. It's about understanding the system well enough to position yourself where its reach is limited. In 1933, people who held rare gold coins were able to keep them when almost all other gold was called in. The reason wasn't magic. It was legal definition. The executive order specifically exempted coins of recognized numismatic value. That's what created the dividing line between those who lost their gold and those who didn't. The same principle can apply to silver. Right now, most silver investors focus on ounces. They compare the spot price, premiums, mint marks, and purity. They aim to get the most metal for their money. That makes sense if the only risk you're thinking about is price volatility. But if you widen your view to include political risk, the risk of reclassification or seizure, then the form you hold becomes just as important as the quantity. A once bullion coin from a modern mint might be cheaper to buy, but it's also the first in line to be defined as monetary silver if the rules change. A coin that has historical or collectible status, on the other hand, might carry a higher premium now, but that premium could be insignificant compared to the protection it offers in a crisis. When the definitions shift, The legal category you occupy will determine whether your asset is subject to the new rules or exempt from them. Some investors dismiss this thinking as overly cautious. They assume that if such measures were ever taken, the government would simply grab everything of value. But history doesn't support that view. Even in the most extreme cases, there have been exemptions, often for practical reasons. Numismatic coins are harder to value in bulk. Their supply is scattered, and seizing them would provoke more resistance for relative